The test of integrity. The evening sun dipped low over the skyline, its golden glow spilling through the tall glass windows of the Mitchell Towers. On the 42nd floor, in an office larger than some houses, a man sat in his leather armchair as though the weight of the entire city pressed upon his shoulders. Thomas Mitchell, billionaire industrialist, self-made magnate, and a man whose name alone could silence entire boardrooms, rested with his eyes half shut, his body angled as if he were in the middle of an afternoon nap. To anyone who entered, he would appear vulnerable, perhaps even careless, but beneath his half-closed lids, Thomas was wide awake. He was watching, waiting, and testing. Behind him, the polished steel safe loomed in plain sight. Its heavy door swung wide open. Inside, stacks of cash sat neatly arranged yet deliberately disturbed, bills jutting out at odd angles, as though someone had already rifled through them. The scene had been crafted with meticulous precision. The desk lamp glowed just brightly enough to highlight the temptation, the curtains half drawn to allow shadows to creep across the room, and the faint aroma of cold coffee lingered from a cup placed carefully on the edge of his desk. Everything had been staged to create a single, perfect scenario: money exposed, authority asleep, and the lure of easy wealth within reach. Thomas had orchestrated this test not on a whim, but out of an old wound that refused to heal. Years earlier, he had been betrayed by a business partner he had trusted more than a brother. That partner had embezzled millions, hollowing out not only Thomas's accounts but also his belief in human loyalty. Since then, suspicion had become Thomas's constant companion. He trusted contracts, clauses, and surveillance cameras more than he trusted handshakes or promises. Yet despite all his cynicism, there was a part of him that longed, perhaps desperately, to believe that honesty still existed. Tonight, he intended to find out. The office door creaked open, breaking the thick silence. Diana Jefferson, the night janitor, entered cautiously, her modest uniform freshly pressed, her face marked with the fatigue of someone who worked 2 jobs yet carried herself with quiet dignity. Pushing her cleaning cart with one hand, she held the other gently on the shoulder of her young son Jaden, who accompanied her during summer break. The boy was 6 years old, a small child with big, curious eyes that seemed to take in the world without filters of fear or guile. He wore tiny pink gloves, his mother's old pair cut down to size, as though helping with her chores required the seriousness of a uniform. "Good evening, Mr. Mitchell," Diana whispered respectfully, lowering her voice so as not to disturb her employer. She assumed he was sleeping, as he so often did during late evenings after endless hours of meetings. With practiced efficiency, she guided her cart toward the row of bookshelves, her movements careful and deliberate. But Jaden's attention drifted elsewhere. The boy's gaze wandered across the vast office, the towering shelves filled with books and awards, the glossy desk that seemed to stretch like a stage, and finally, the strange sight at the back of the room. His eyes froze upon the open safe. The glimmer of bills caught the faint light, and his head tilted slightly, curiosity drawing him nearer. From beneath his lowered lashes, Thomas watched. His heart pounded not with fear but with the kind of intensity one feels when betting everything on a single moment. Would the boy's small hands reach out to take what lay so invitingly within? Would instinct guide him toward greed as Thomas had long suspected of human nature? Or would he walk away, proving that perhaps decency was not entirely extinct? Jaden shuffled closer. His steps were light, hesitant, but his expression revealed no mischief, only concentration, as though he had stumbled upon a puzzle that demanded fixing. When he reached the safe, he frowned in puzzlement, the way a child might frown at a stack of messy crayons. Without hesitation, he lifted one bundle of cash, straightened its edges, and placed it back neatly. Then another, then another. His small, pink-gloved hands moved with surprising precision, aligning each stack as though he were organizing the pennies and nickels his mother let him count at home. "Mom," Jaden whispered, his voice carrying a note of innocent urgency. "Mr. Thomas's money is messy. I'll fix it like you taught me to do with ours." Diana spun around, her eyes widening in alarm when she saw her son near the open safe. "Jaden," she hissed under her breath, rushing toward him. "Don't touch your boss's things." "But he won't like it messy," Jaden protested, his tone sincere, not rebellious. He had taken nothing, hidden nothing, only straightened the piles as though tidiness itself was a sacred duty. With his task complete, he clasped his small hands behind his back, stepping away as though he had merely borrowed the money for a moment and returned it in better condition. Diana's heart pounded in her chest as she placed a protective hand on her son's shoulder. "Thank you for helping, but some things are not ours to touch," she said softly, her voice trembling with both reprimand and tenderness. Then, almost instinctively, she turned toward the armchair and gave a small bow of apology to her employer, never realizing he was watching everything through half-shut eyes. From his chair, Thomas felt something stir within him, something he had not allowed himself to feel in years. The boy had been close enough to claim thousands, close enough to slip even a single bill into his pocket, without anyone knowing, yet he had done the opposite. He had shown care, order, and above all, respect. No guile, no hidden agenda, just the pure instinct of a child raised to value dignity over possession. Jaden soon returned to the corner of the office, pulling out his workbook and settling down on the floor to continue his homework. Every so often his eyes flickered toward the safe, not with hunger, but with a kind of watchfulness, as though guarding it on behalf of its sleeping owner. Diana resumed her cleaning, whispering her moral mantra to her son. "Other people's things are sacred. We don't take, we don't pry. If it's messy, we tidy it up to make them happy." The words echoed in Thomas's mind. He had heard them once before, faintly, through the company's hidden microphones installed to monitor staff performance. At the time, he had dismissed them as background noise. But tonight, hearing them again in this context, they struck him with the force of revelation. When Diana and her son finally left the office, the soft squeak of the cart wheels fading into the corridor, Thomas opened his eyes fully and rose from his chair. He walked to the safe, his steps slow and deliberate, and stared at the stacks of cash. They had been rearranged with the precision of an accountant, each bill aligned as if drawn with a ruler. For the first time in years, Thomas felt a swell of warmth in his chest, not the warmth of victory or wealth, but the warmth of hope. He shut the safe, turning the dial until the lock clicked firmly in place. He considered laughing, a deep, relieved laugh that might have cleared the bitterness from his heart, but he restrained himself. Instead, he walked back to his desk, opened his laptop, and typed a short email to his head of HR. "Preserve all camera footage from tonight's shift. Do not delete anything. Schedule audio system maintenance next week. KTM." The message was brief, neutral in tone, but it carried the weight of meaning only Sandra Miller, his trusted HR director, would recognize. Thomas then pulled up Diana Jefferson's employee file, flagging it for review. Not for punishment, but for recognition. He detested the word bonus. To him it sounded like charity, but he believed in fairness, and fairness demanded acknowledgement of extraordinary conduct. Above him, the fluorescent light buzzed faintly, like a hum of something being set back into order. For years, Thomas had believed that money revealed the worst in people. Yet tonight, in the quiet presence of a child with pink gloves and an honest heart, he had glimpsed something different, something better. And he knew this was only the beginning. The silent cameras. The following week unfolded much like any other inside Mitchell Enterprises, but for Thomas Mitchell, nothing felt ordinary. His mind lingered on that quiet night, on the small boy with pink gloves who had unknowingly stepped into a test designed to expose greed and corruption. For days, the memory of Jaden's small hands arranging bills in careful order replayed in Thomas's head with almost cinematic clarity. It had not been the action alone that moved him, but the natural innocence behind it. There had been no hesitation, no sneaky glance over his shoulder, no sense of mischief in the child's posture. Instead, there was an instinctive tidiness and a respect that spoke volumes about how the boy had been raised. It was that discovery more than anything that kept Thomas awake at night. As was his habit, Thomas spent long evenings in his office reviewing documents and monitoring the company's internal systems. He had always been meticulous about security, a trait born of both necessity and past betrayal. Security cameras recorded every corner of the building, not simply to catch theft, but to ensure order, accountability, and performance. For most executives, these recordings were reviewed only when an incident occurred. For Thomas, they were a library of truth, small windows into the character of those who served under him. He began to revisit the feeds more often now, and as he did, he noticed patterns he had previously overlooked. Each night, Diana arrived quietly with her son. She never lingered for conversation, never asked for favors, and never once treated her duties as beneath her dignity. Her son, too, had a rhythm, unpacking his small workbook, scratching notes with a pencil stub, and occasionally offering to help with harmless little tasks like stacking paper or wiping down a corner of the desk. Each time his hand brushed something, Diana would gently remind him, "Other people's things are sacred. We do not take. We only leave them better than we found them." The mantra echoed again and again, each repetition hammering into the boy's consciousness, shaping him like clay under a careful hand. What fascinated Thomas most was not simply Diana's discipline, but the boy's unshaken acceptance of it. Children often rebelled, especially when faced with restrictions. Yet Jaden absorbed these lessons without resistance, as though he saw them not as rules, but as natural laws of life. The security footage captured their exchanges, sometimes tender, sometimes stern, but always grounded in respect. Watching it felt to Thomas like overhearing a hymn, a refrain of values long forgotten in his world of cutthroat deals and legal contracts. But Thomas was not the only one observing. In the quarterly budget meeting, when financial sheets were presented for discussion, Richard Blackwood, the company's vice president of operations, leaned back in his chair, his sharp eyes scanning the columns of numbers until they landed on a single detail. He tapped his pen against the page, his voice smooth but edged with arrogance. "Why," he drawled, "are we suddenly spending more on janitorial services this quarter? And why does one employee in that group appear to have received a pay increase?" The room grew still. Executives glanced at one another but remained silent, waiting to see how Thomas would respond. Thomas, calm as ever, closed the folder before him and lifted his gaze. "Because Diana Jefferson has demonstrated exceptional reliability and performance," he replied evenly. Richard tilted his head, a smirk curling across his lips. "Reliability and performance? We're talking about a janitor, not a partner in law or finance. You need to remember who these people are. You give them a dime, and they'll demand the whole vault. It's their nature." The words hung in the air like poison. Several members of the board shifted uncomfortably, their expressions betraying disapproval, but no one dared confront the Blackwood name. Richard's family lineage ran deep into the company's history. They were part of its roots, twisted tightly around its foundation, like an old tree that could not easily be uprooted. To oppose Richard was to invite personal and political fallout. Thomas said nothing. He tapped his pen once against the table and continued with the meeting as though the comment had passed unheard. But inside, anger churned, not loud or explosive, but steady, a slow-burning heat that settled deep in his chest. He had expected prejudice in the world, yes, but not delivered so brazenly in his own boardroom. The moment the word invisible had later been used, the quiet rage within him had transformed into something more dangerous: resolve. That evening, long after the executives had gone home, Diana wheeled her cart through the dimly lit hallways of the 42nd floor, her son trailing close at her side. She carried herself with the same steady grace, but tonight the air was heavier, as though something unseen pressed upon the building. When she turned the corner, Richard Blackwood appeared from the shadows, his suit crisp, his posture blocking the path like a gatekeeper. "Listen," Richard said coldly, his voice low enough that the cameras might not catch the venom in his tone. "I know you've been receiving more than you deserve. I don't care what you did to get it, but stop pushing your luck. And don't bring the boy here again. This is a workplace, not a daycare." Jaden froze, his small fist tightening inside the pink gloves. His mother's hand instinctively pulled him closer, her chin lifting as she met Richard's gaze without fear. "Sir," she said evenly, her voice trembling only slightly, "I am here to do my job. Nothing more, nothing less." Richard's smirk widened into something uglier. "Your job," he said, each word deliberate, "is to clean and stay invisible. Period." With that, he stepped aside and strode down the hall, his polished shoes echoing against the marble like a judge's gavel. Upstairs in his office, Thomas had seen everything through the hallway camera. He rewound the footage 3 times, listening to each poisonous syllable, each flick of contempt in Richard's tone. The rage that filled him was not the sharp spark of insult, but the slow, crushing weight of injustice. For years, he had prided himself on running a company of discipline and standards, but if those standards had allowed a child to be told his mother was invisible, then something was deeply broken at its core. That night, Thomas sat at his desk long after the building emptied. The glow of the monitors reflected off his glasses as he composed a single message to an old friend. Marcus, I need you for a case of power abuse with a stench of systemic bias. The name is Richard Blackwood. Bring me evidence that no one can dispute. On the other end of the city, Marcus Chen, former FBI investigator turned corporate probe specialist, read the message in silence. His reply came moments later, sharp and clipped. Easier than taking candy from a kid. But for this, the evidence must be bulletproof. No cracks, no escape. Thomas leaned back in his chair, the hum of the city outside blending with the steady thrum of his own heartbeat. He thought again of Jaden, of the boy's innocent voice whispering that the money was messy and needed fixing. If a child could see the world so clearly, then surely a man with power had no excuse for blindness. The cameras had been silent witnesses for too long. Now they would speak. Seeds of resistance. The morning after Richard's poisonous confrontation with Diana lingered like smoke in Thomas Mitchell's mind. He had watched the footage more than once, each replay sharpening his anger into focus. The words, "stay invisible," replayed in his head, bitter and corrosive, clashing against the image of Jaden's small fists curling in silent defiance. That boy had done nothing more than accompany his mother, completing schoolwork quietly in the corner, and yet in Richard's eyes, even his presence was an offense. Thomas knew then that what he had witnessed was not a single act of cruelty, but a symptom of something deeper, something woven into the company's culture over years of unchecked arrogance. And he, the man at the top, could no longer pretend not to see it. Marcus Chen arrived 2 days later, stepping into Thomas's office with the quiet confidence of someone who had stared down criminals far more ruthless than corporate executives. His sharp eyes scanned the room, noting details like a detective cataloging a crime scene. "You've got rot in your house," Marcus said without preamble, dropping his briefcase on the desk. "If you want me to cut it out, you'd better be prepared for blood." Thomas steepled his fingers and leaned forward. "I want Richard Blackwood exposed, but I don't want rumors, Marcus. I want proof. Proof so clear that not even his family connections can shield him." Marcus smirked faintly. "Then you came to the right man. But understand this, when I start digging, I'll find more than you asked for. You don't pull on a single thread without unraveling the whole garment." And unravel he did. Within a week, Marcus uncovered whispers of irregular expense accounts, misappropriated funds funneled into shell companies, and records of intimidation aimed at employees who resisted Richard's directives. But Marcus was cautious. Whispers weren't enough. He wanted something undeniable, a smoking gun that would silence even the staunchest defenders of the Blackwood name. Meanwhile, Richard continued to operate as though untouchable, his smirk ever present, his eyes sharp with suspicion that someone somewhere was watching. Diana, of course, knew nothing of the investigation brewing above her head. Her world remained simple. Long hours of work, the weight of bills waiting at home, and the constant presence of her son, who clung to her side like a shadow. Yet she began to feel the chill of Richard's animosity. Some nights she found tasks doubled without explanation, her supply requests delayed, or her schedule shifted without notice. These were petty acts, but Diana recognized them for what they were, punishments designed to wear her down. Still, she endured them with quiet resilience, whispering to Jaden the same refrain, and she always did. "We do not complain. We do not take shortcuts. We do what is right even when no one sees." But Jaden saw. He saw the extra weight his mother carried in her shoulders, the way she pressed her lips together when Richard's name was mentioned. For a 6-year-old, he had an uncanny sense of justice, and it burned in him like a spark threatening to catch fire. One evening, as Diana scrubbed at the marble floor, Jaden looked up from his workbook and said, "Mama, why does that man not like you? You clean better than anyone. You make everything shine." Diana paused, her hands tightening around the mop handle. She looked at her son, his eyes wide with the kind of honesty only children possessed. Sometimes, Jaden, people don't see the shine. They only see what they want to see. The boy frowned. Then I'll make them see. I'll tell Mr. Thomas. Diana's heart nearly stopped. No, sweetheart, she said quickly, kneeling to meet his eyes. You must never put yourself in danger. Mr. Thomas is busy. He does not need to hear from us. But Jaden shook his head with the stubbornness of a child who had already made up his mind. Mr. Thomas is fair. I know it. I saw it in his eyes even when he was sleeping. He's not like the other man. Unbeknownst to them, Thomas was indeed listening. Not in that very moment, but through the silent cameras that recorded every word. He had grown almost addicted to watching the Jeffersons' nightly rituals, not out of voyeurism, but because they reminded him of something pure, something untouched by greed. And when he heard Jaden's small voice speak of him with such certainty, Thomas felt an unfamiliar pressure in his chest, as though he were being called to account by a child's unshakable belief. Meanwhile, Richard grew restless. The cracks Marcus had begun to pry open left him uneasy, though he could not see their source. One afternoon, in a move both arrogant and desperate, Richard stormed into HR, slamming a stack of papers onto Sandra M. Ehler's desk. I want this employee disciplined immediately, he barked. The papers contained a litany of accusations against Diana: tardiness, failure to meet cleaning standards, disruptive behavior caused by her son. Sandra scanned the documents, her brow furrowing. The time logs Richard cited were falsified, the complaints vague, and the evidence non-existent. She lifted her gaze slowly, her voice calm but firm. These allegations don't match our records, Richard. Richard leaned in, his eyes cold. Fix the records, then. You and I both know a company runs smoother when the people at the bottom don't get ideas about moving up. Sandra's lips tightened, but she said nothing. After all, she had learned long ago that confronting Richard directly was like throwing a pebble at a storm. But when he left, she forwarded the complaint to Thomas with a single line. You need to see this. Thomas did see it, and the fury that rose in him was quieter now, more dangerous for its control. He understood what Richard was attempting, not merely to discredit Diana, but to erase her entirely. And in that moment, Thomas knew this was no longer just about a woman and her son. It was about the soul of his company. That night, as Diana pushed her cart through the deserted hallways, Richard appeared again, his shadow stretching long across the marble floor. This time, he did not bother with subtlety. Do you know what happens to people who think they're special? He hissed, stepping so close that Jaden instinctively moved between him and his mother. They get crushed. Don't test me. Diana's hand tightened on her son's shoulder, her voice steady despite the fear she felt. We don't think we're special, sir. We only do our job. But before Richard could sneer another word, Jaden spoke up, his small voice ringing with unexpected strength. You're wrong. My mama is special. She's the best. Cleaner, and she never steals, and she never lies. You're the one who doesn't shine. For the first time, Richard faltered. He looked down at the boy, his mouth opening in shock at the audacity of a child daring to defy him. Rage flickered across his face, but before he could lash out, Diana pulled her son back, her eyes blazing with protective fire. Come, Jaden, she said, her voice firm. We have work to do. They walked away, their heads high, leaving Richard fuming in the hallway. What none of them realized was that every word, every glare, every defiant whisper had been caught on camera. Upstairs, in the darkness of his office, Thomas replayed the scene with trembling hands. His chest swelled with pride and fury all at once. Pride in the courage of a child who refused to bow, and fury at the corruption that had forced him to speak at all. Thomas leaned back in his chair, his jaw set. The time for quiet observation was ending. Richard Blackwood had crossed a line, and soon the world would see the truth. The fall of the vice president. For days, the quiet machinery of investigation whirred beneath the polished floors of Mitchell Enterprises. Marcus Chen moved like a shadow through the company's digital and paper trails, unearthing fragments of truth with the precision of a surgeon cutting out a tumor. He interviewed low-level staff discreetly, reviewed years of financial statements, and cross-referenced vendor contracts against shell companies that only existed on paper. With each discovery, the portrait of Richard Blackwood darkened. Unauthorized expense reimbursements disguised as operational overhead, kickbacks from suppliers hidden in offshore accounts, and a long pattern of intimidation directed at anyone who dared to question him. Marcus did not move quickly. He moved thoroughly. He knew that against a man like Richard, shielded by family wealth and influence, partial evidence would crumble like dust. What Thomas needed was proof so irrefutable that even the Blackwood name could not bury it. Meanwhile, Richard carried on with the smugness of someone convinced his power was untouchable. In meetings, he cut off subordinates mid-sentence, his sarcasm dripping like acid across the table. In hallways, he walked with the casual arrogance of a man who believed the building itself bowed to him. He never suspected that the walls were closing in, that every email, every falsified record, every cruel word was being woven into a tapestry that would soon choke him. Yet, in his arrogance, Richard sensed something shifting. He began to notice glances exchanged behind his back, hushed conversations in corners, the sudden presence of Thomas in meetings he normally avoided. Suspicion gnawed at him, but his pride told him he had nothing to fear. After all, he was a Blackwood. Who would dare to challenge that legacy? Diana, unknowingly caught in the center of this storm, continued her work with the same quiet resilience. Her hours grew longer, her tasks heavier, and her son's presence more scrutinized than ever before. Yet she carried on, her dignity unshaken. Jaden, too, felt the tension, but never faltered. He remained his mother's silent guardian, watching the corridors with eyes far older than his years. On one particularly long night, when Diana bent over her mop with exhaustion tugging at her shoulders, Jaden placed a small hand on her arm. "Mama," he whispered, "one day everyone will know how hard you work. Even the mean man won't be able to hide it." His words, so simple and so certain, filled her with a strength she didn't realize she still possessed. Upstairs, Thomas watched these scenes unfold through his private monitors, each one a nail in the coffin of Richard's cruelty. He was no longer the detached billionaire testing human nature for sport. He was a man who had witnessed integrity, courage, and dignity in its purest form, and he knew it was his responsibility to protect it. Still, he remained patient, waiting for Marcus to deliver the final piece of the puzzle. When it came, it arrived like a thunderclap. Marcus entered Thomas's office one late evening carrying a thick binder, the kind that could crush a man's reputation with its weight alone. He dropped it onto the desk, and the sound echoed in the cavernous room. "It's done," Marcus said simply. "Expense fraud, intimidation, misuse of funds, discrimination, all documented, cross-verified, and backed by witness testimony. He can't wiggle out of this one. If you want to end him, the board will have no choice but to side with you." Thomas opened the binder, his eyes scanning the pages of evidence. There were financial records showing false transactions, signed approvals leading directly to Richard, testimonies from staff who had been silenced under threat, and even footage from the hallway where Richard had confronted Diana and Jaden. Seeing the boy's small defiance captured on the page juxtaposed against Richard's sneering face ignited something in Thomas's chest. It was not just anger anymore. It was justice demanding to be unleashed. The stage was set for the next board meeting, but Thomas was not a man who enjoyed spectacle. He preferred precision, control, and quiet destruction. Yet he also knew that some truths required light to cleanse them, and Richard's corruption had to be exposed in full daylight, in front of those who had once cowered beneath his family's shadow. The day of the meeting arrived with a tension so thick it seemed to pulse in the air. The boardroom, with its long mahogany table and panoramic view of the city, filled slowly as members took their seats. Richard entered last, his tailored suit immaculate, his confidence unshaken. He smirked as he took his chair, his eyes glinting with the assurance of a man who believed himself untouchable. Thomas opened the meeting as he always did, his voice calm, measured, almost clinical. The early discussions floating. Owed as expected, updates on quarterly earnings, projections for upcoming ventures, and minor adjustments to departmental budgets. But then Thomas paused, his gaze sweeping the room before landing squarely on Richard. "Before we conclude," he said, his voice carrying a weight that silenced the room, "there is a matter of grave importance we must address." He gestured, and Marcus, seated quietly in the corner like a silent executioner, rose and placed the binder on the table. Thomas opened it, revealing the first page, a summary of financial irregularities tied directly to Richard Blackwood's signature. Murmurs rippled across the boardroom as eyes scanned the damning evidence. Richard's smirk faltered for the first time, his hand twitching toward the binder as though he could close it by sheer will. "This company was built on integrity," Thomas continued, his voice steady but edged with steel. "But integrity cannot survive when those in power abuse their positions. What you will find in these pages is not rumor or speculation. It is fact, documented, verified, undeniable fact. Mr. Blackwood has engaged in repeated acts of fraud, intimidation, and discrimination. He has betrayed not only this company, but every individual who works within its walls." The silence that followed was deafening. Richard's face flushed crimson, his arrogance collapsing into fury. "This is outrageous," he shouted, slamming his fist against the table. "You're fabricating lies to push me out because you can't stand the fact that my family built half of this empire." But Thomas did not flinch. He pressed a button on the remote before him, and the screens around the boardroom flickered to life. Grainy footage appeared. Richard in the hallway, looming over Diana and Jaden, his voice dripping with disdain. "Your job is to clean and stay invisible, period." The words reverberated through the room, undeniable, unfiltered, and damning. Gasps echoed as board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Richard's power, once so absolute, crumbled before their eyes. When the footage ended, Thomas leaned forward, his gaze locked on Richard. "This company does not belong to the Blackwood name. It belongs to those who honor its principles, and I will not allow it to be corrupted any longer." The board members exchanged glances, their silence carrying the weight of agreement. For the first time, Richard's name offered no shield. The evidence was too strong, the shame too public, the truth too undeniable. Richard sputtered, his words collapsing into incoherent rage, but no one came to his defense. The legacy he had relied upon for protection had turned into an anchor, dragging him down before the very people who once feared him. Thomas closed the binder with a decisive snap. "Effective immediately," he declared. "Richard Blackwood is suspended from all duties pending legal review. A vote for permanent removal will be held at once." The hands around the table lifted one by one until the decision was unanimous. Richard's reign of arrogance was over. He stood, his face twisted in fury, but found no ally in the room. For the first time in his career, he was truly alone. As he stormed out, the heavy doors slamming shut behind him, a strange calm settled over the boardroom. Thomas exhaled slowly, his chest rising with the weight of what had just transpired. Justice at last had taken its first breath, yet he knew this was only the beginning. The rot had been exposed, but the company would need rebuilding, healing, and a new vision of dignity. And at the center of that vision stood a boy with pink gloves, whose simple honesty had sparked a revolution. Legacy of integrity. The storm that had shaken Mitchell Enterprises in the boardroom did not end with the slamming of the heavy oak doors. In fact, it marked only the beginning of a slow and deliberate reconstruction. Removing Richard Blackwood had been a victory, but it left scars. Scars on the company's reputation, scars on the employees who had endured his cruelty, and scars within Thomas Mitchell himself, who had realized with painful clarity that silence in the face of injustice was itself a form of complicity. For weeks after the dramatic confrontation, Thomas carried the weight of this revelation like a stone in his chest. He was a man who had prided himself on efficiency, discipline, and vision. But he now understood that a company, like a man, was measured not by the wealth it produced, but by the integrity it protected. In the weeks that followed Richard's removal, Thomas quietly shifted the culture of the company. Policies were revised, employee support systems were strengthened, and whistleblower protections were enhanced so that no one, not even the most junior janitor, could be silenced again. Meetings that once operated like cold machines now opened with discussions about employee well-being and respect. At first, these changes were met with skepticism. Years of intimidation had left workers wary of believing that true reform was possible. But slowly, as they saw real protections put into place, they began to breathe a little easier, their shoulders loosening, their voices growing stronger. It was not immediate, but the tide was turning. Through it all, Diana Jefferson continued her work with quiet grace, though life for her and her son was no longer the same. Without ceremony or spectacle, Thomas had ordered HR to adjust her pay grade significantly, but in a way that did not paint her as a charity case. He despised the notion of parading gratitude in front of others, so her raise appeared like a natural promotion, a recognition of seniority and excellence. Diana had at first been confused when her paycheck reflected the increase, but she accepted it with humility, teaching her son that blessings, like burdens, should be carried with dignity. More importantly, she found that her shifts were shorter, her workload lighter, and her son was no longer treated as a disruption, but as part of the building's quiet rhythm. Jaden continued to bring his homework, continued to straighten papers, and continued to whisper his mother's mantra. Other people's things are sacred. We do not take. We leave them better. For Thomas, those words had become more than a mantra. They had become a foundation. In his office, he replayed footage of Jaden at the safe, the pink gloves gently straightening bills with the seriousness of an accountant. That single moment had been the seed, and from it, an entire forest of reform had grown. He began to see Jaden not just as a child, but as a mirror reflecting the kind of man Thomas wanted to be. Where Thomas had once tested others out of cynicism, he now tested himself out of conviction. Could he, a billionaire accustomed to power, live up to the standards of a 6-year-old boy who had chosen order over temptation? Months later, when Richard's crimes became public and the press swarmed around Mitchell Enterprises, Thomas did something unexpected. Instead of issuing a polished corporate statement drafted by lawyers, he held a press conference himself. Standing at the podium before flying cameras, he spoke not of stock prices or restructuring plans, but of integrity. This company, he said, his deep voice carrying across the sea of reporters, was tested and we nearly failed. But sometimes it takes the smallest among us to remind us of what is sacred. Integrity is not measured by wealth or power or position. It is measured in what we do when no one is watching. And I have seen that integrity firsthand, in a child who chose honesty when temptation lay within his grasp. The world buzzed with curiosity at those words. Who was this child? Reporters dug into the story, discovering whispers of a janitor's son, though Thomas himself never gave names. He protected Diana and Jaden fiercely, understanding that dignity required privacy. Still, the story leaked in fragments, and though the public never knew the full details, the symbolic power of it was undeniable. Employees across the company began to hold themselves differently, inspired by the idea that even the lowest-ranked worker could set an example for the highest-ranked executive. Years passed, and the Jeffersons' lives transformed in ways neither of them could have imagined. Diana was quietly promoted into a supervisory role, no longer pushing carts through silent hallways but overseeing teams, ensuring that the values she had instilled in her son were passed down to every worker under her care. She remained humble, never forgetting the nights when exhaustion pressed against her bones. But she carried herself with a new kind of strength, the strength of a woman recognized, not erased. As for Jaden, his path unfolded with the same clarity he had shown as a boy. Thomas, without ever announcing it, ensured that scholarships and opportunities flowed his way. A discreet trust fund was set aside, ensuring that when Jaden grew older, money would never be the obstacle it had once been. But Thomas did not simply hand him a future. He gave him the tools to shape it. He arranged mentorships, introduced him to leaders, and taught him the discipline of responsibility. One act of honesty can change the world, Thomas told him one evening, the two of them standing by the window overlooking the glowing city. Never underestimate the power of doing what is right, even when no one is watching. Jaden grew into a man who carried those words like armor. He excelled in school, driven not by greed, but by a deep conviction that integrity was his inheritance. Years later, when he stood before a crowded auditorium as a young scholar, delivering a speech on ethics and leadership, he told the story, not of a billionaire, not of boardroom politics, but of a single night in a quiet office where temptation had sat on open display. I was just a boy, he said, his voice steady, but I learned that night that what we do in small moments matters more than what we dream in big ones. My mother taught me that other people's things are sacred, and that lesson shaped the man I am today. In the audience, Thomas sat quietly, his hands folded in his lap, his chest swelling with pride. He had lived long enough to build empires, weather betrayals, and wield power that shaped cities. But nothing had given him greater satisfaction than watching this young man, once a child in pink gloves, stand before the world as proof that honesty, dignity, and respect were forces stronger than wealth itself. That evening, as the crowd rose in applause and Jaden bowed his head with humility, Thomas felt something within him finally settle. He no longer saw himself as the man betrayed by partners or hardened by suspicion. He saw himself as a custodian of the lesson Jaden had taught him, that justice begins in the smallest acts and integrity once planted can grow into a legacy that outlives us all.